Beneath the jagged spine of the Carpathian Mountains, where the deep beech forests of 17th-century Moldavia cast unbroken shadows over the river valleys, the earth did not offer rest to the departed. In the early decades of that century, isolation was both a shield and a prison for the rural principalities. Settlements clung to the hillsides like collections of weathered timber and thatch, separated from the wider world by impassable mud tracks, swollen mountain torrents, and the perpetual, suffocating fear of what drifted in from the trade routes. When disaster came, it moved without sound. It arrived as a subtle shift in the air, a rancid sweetness carrying across the damp clearings, heralding the arrival of an invisible pestilence that spared neither infant nor elder. To the peasantry of these isolated Moldavian valleys, the world was governed by strict spiritual balances, maintained through the vigilant rituals of the Eastern Orthodox faith and an older, deeply entrenched stratum of ancestral folklore. Life was hard, carved from cold clay and dense timber, but death was expected to follow a dignified, well-trodden path. A soul was meant to linger near its ancestral hearth for 40 days, guided by the flickering light of beeswax tapers and the solemn intonations of the village priest, before crossing into eternity to await the final resurrection. The body, washed in well water and wrapped in coarse homespun linen, belonged in the consecrated soil of the churchyard, laid carefully upon its back, hands crossed over the chest, facing eastward toward the rising sun to meet its savior. Yet when the great sickness fell upon the valley in the middle of the 17th century, the ancient order crumbled beneath a tide of inexplicable horror. Entire families collapsed within days of one another. The illness manifested with sudden, violent fevers, agonizing swellings beneath the armpits and groins, and black vomit that stained the earthen floors of peasant cottages. The small wooden churches, smelling of frankincense and damp rot, could barely contain the bodies awaiting burial. Gravediggers worked until their calloused palms blistered and bled, cutting trench after trench into the stony, rain-soaked earth. It was during these hurried interments and the subsequent disturbances of shallow graves that the living began to notice phenomena that defied their understanding of natural decay. When fresh graves were reopened to receive newly deceased kin, the gravediggers and mourning relatives peered into the wooden coffins and saw what appeared to be impossible life in the midst of death. In the cold, oxygen-poor clay of the mountain foothills, decomposition did not follow the dry, predictable path the villagers anticipated. Instead, the corpses were found bloated, their bellies swollen taut like drums beneath their linen shrouds. Rather than turning pale and skeletal, the skin of the deceased often appeared flushed, dark, and ruddy, as though gorged on vitality. Most terrifying of all was the dark, frothy fluid that purged from the mouths and nostrils of the dead, staining the burial cloths with what looked unmistakably like fresh, spilled blood. In our modern understanding, these grotesque transformations are known as the elementary mechanics of postmortem biology. Internal bacteria, multiplying unchecked in the abdominal cavity, generate voluminous gases that distend the torso, push the diaphragm upward, and force liquefied tissue and blood up through the respiratory tract and out the oral cavity. Rigor mortis passes, leaving the limbs unnaturally pliable and soft to the touch, while the contraction of drying skin gives the illusion that hair and fingernails have continued to grow in the dark of the tomb. To the 17th century Moldavian peasant, however, science had no voice. The only framework capable of explaining such ghastly vitality was the ancient terror of the Strigoi. In local belief, the Strigoi was not a distant myth, but a catastrophic physical reality, a dead soul that refused to depart, trapped between the planes of existence by a violent passing, an unbaptized lineage, or the curse of pestilence. The bloated abdomen was not the accumulation of putrefactive gas, but the physical evidence of gluttonous feeding. The blood trickling down the chin was not cellular purge, but the stolen life force of the living, consumed in the dead of night. Panic spread through the settlements faster than the contagion itself. The terror became intimately personal. It was observed that death moved through households in a terrifying, sequential chain. First, a patriarch would succumb to the fever. Within 3 days, his wife would weaken, complaining in her delirium of a crushing weight upon her chest during the night, of terrible nightmares in which her departed husband stood over her sleeping form, drawing the breath from her lungs. Days later, the children would follow, pale and hollow-eyed, their vitality drained away until their hearts ceased to beat. The living were thoroughly convinced that the dead were not resting. They believed that those who entered the soil first were reaching up through the cold earth, drawing their surviving relatives down into the grave after them. Every creak of the timber beams at midnight, every sudden gust of wind down the chimney, and every shadow cast by the tallow candles was interpreted as the restless dead returning to claim their remaining flesh and blood. The village turned inward, consumed by an ambient dread so heavy that neighbors ceased speaking, locking their heavy oak doors at sundown, scattering mustard seeds across their thresholds, and burning wild garlic upon their hearthstones in desperate, futile attempts to bar the spectral intruders. By the time the autumn of the year 1648 settled over the Moldavian highlands, the crisis had reached an absolute breaking point. That year, an exceptionally lethal wave of sickness swept through a remote, tightly clustered settlement perched near a tributary of the Prut River. The death toll mounted with such relentless ferocity that the churchyard began to resemble a plowed field of overturned, weeping mud. Multiple members of the same families were being lowered into the ground every single morning, and the cries of the grieving were replaced by a cold, petrified silence. The traditional spiritual remedies were failing entirely. The village Eastern Orthodox priest walked among the cottages, swinging his bronze censer, scattering holy water over the thresholds, and reciting ancient prayers of deliverance against demonic oppression. He pleaded with his flock to remain steadfast in canonical faith, assuring them that the sickness was a divine trial to be met with fasting, repentance, and orderly Christian interments. But the villagers could see the red stains on the shrouds of their exhumed relatives. They felt the inexplicable, icy drafts in their bedrooms. They watched their children waste away one by one. Faith in canonical salvation collapsed beneath the primal instinct for survival. Late one evening in the bitter October of 1648, beneath a sky thick with the promise of early mountain snow, the village elders, councilmen, and gravediggers gathered in secret away from the ears of the priest. They met in a smoke-filled barn on the periphery of the village, their faces illuminated only by the dull amber glow of a single tallow lantern. In their hands they held the tools of their daily toil: shovels, pickaxes, heavy iron wood-splitting wedges, and hand-forged agricultural sickles. The discussion was not about prayer or divine mercy, it was an act of desperate war against the cemetery. The consensus among the elders was absolute: the traditional Christian burials had left the living defenseless. By laying the corpses on their backs, facing the sky with hands folded loosely upon their chests, the village had unwittingly provided the reanimated dead with the ideal posture to rise, push aside the loose earth, and walk the night. The council resolved that the cemetery had to be fundamentally remade into a prison. The dead could no longer be honored as ancestors awaiting the resurrection, they had to be contained as physical threats to the continuation of the village. The men bound their sleeves with hemp twine, gripped their iron implements, and finalized a strategy that would violently sever their practices from centuries of Christian orthodoxy. They resolved that henceforth, every individual taken by the pestilence, and every corpse suspected of returning to torment the living, would be subjected to severe, physical suppression beneath the soil. As the meeting adjourned into the freezing mist of the early morning, the gravediggers stepped out into the mud, carrying their spades toward the freshly dug pits of the parish cemetery. The era of traditional rest had ended for the valley. From this moment forward, the dead would no longer be permitted to look toward the heavens. The damp October mist of 1648 clung to the tall grass of the parish cemetery as the gravediggers set to their grim work under the dim, flickering light of a single tallow lantern. Their boots sank deep into the black Moldavian clay, which smelled heavily of wet leaf mold and cold, stagnant rot. On a low wooden bier lay the body of a young man, the latest victim of the pestilence that had ravaged the valley, his skin pale and bloated, his linen shroud already dark with grease and moisture. For centuries, the customs of their forefathers demanded that his face be turned toward the eastern horizon, towards the rising sun and the promised dawn of the resurrection, his hands folded peacefully across his chest in pious submission. But the men standing over the open pit had cast aside salvation in favor of survival. With heavy, hesitant hands, two gravediggers reached down into the trench, their breath misting in the freezing mountain air. They seized the stiffened shoulders of the corpse and, with a heavy, wet thud, rolled the body onto its stomach. The head flopped sideways before settling firmly face down into the black silt at the bottom of the grave. The logic driving this sacrilege was stark, physical, and unyielding. In the minds of the villagers, the reanimated dead, the Strigoi, retained a dark, desperate physical agency. If the dead man were to awaken in the suffocating darkness beneath the soil, driven by an unholy hunger to escape and feast upon the blood of his kin, his first instinct would be to claw blindly upward toward the light. By turning his face down toward the deep subterranean earth, every violent scrap of his fingernails, every frantic thrust of his limbs, would drive him deeper into the cold, ancient bedrock, trapping him forever within his own subterranean prison. As the first spadefuls of heavy soil rained down upon the back of the turned corpse, a sharp, authoritative voice shattered the silence of the damp morning air. The village Eastern Orthodox priest approached the perimeter of the churchyard, his black cassock trailing through the churned mud, his bronze censer swinging rhythmically in his right hand, wafting clouds of sweet frankincense across the damp graves. His face was pale with fury, his eyes wide with horror as he witnessed the desecration unfolding before him. He raised his heavy iron cross into the air and shouted against the gravediggers, commanding them in the name of the Holy Synod and the Savior to stop their unholy work. He warned them that to bury a baptized Christian face down was an unpardonable sin, an act of blasphemy that denied the deceased the right to behold the second coming of Christ, damning their souls to eternal damnation. The gravediggers paused, their arms resting on the wooden handles of their spades, their eyes darting nervously toward the priest and then down toward the half-buried body. A tense, suffocating silence gripped the cemetery. From the edge of the grave pit stepped forward one of the village elders, his weathered face lined with grief and hardened by months of relentless horror. The elder did not bow his head, nor did he ask for absolution. Instead, he pointed a gloved finger toward the village down in the hollow, where thin wisps of smoke rose from cottages that held 3, 4, or 5 corpses waiting for burial. He spat into the mud and addressed the clergyman directly, declaring that while the church promised salvation for the soul in the afterlife, the face-down burial was the only force capable of protecting the living bodies of their children tonight. He told the priest that if the dead were allowed to lie on their backs looking at the sky, they would continue to walk through the village, draining the life from their sisters and brothers until no one was left alive to light a candle at the altar. The priest pleaded with them, his voice trembling with a mixture of canonical outrage and deep, latent terror. He cited centuries of Orthodox liturgy, explaining that the body was a holy temple meant to sleep peacefully facing the east, awaiting the trumpet call of the archangel. He offered to sprinkle more holy water over the soil, to spend the night performing hours of continuous exorcisms over the freshly dug earth, and to seal the graves with blessed holy oil. But his theological arguments fell upon deaf ears. The peasants had seen the bloated, uncorrupted faces of their exhumed relatives. They had heard the unnatural noises echoes from beneath the earth during the midnight hours. They had felt the cold, lingering presence of the pestilence wiping out whole bloodlines in days. To the villagers, the priestess' prayers were powerless against the physical reality of the reanimated corpse. The gravediggers turned their backs on the priest and resumed shoveling, packing the heavy mud tightly over the prone spine of the deceased until the grave was completely leveled with the surrounding earth. As the autumn turned to a brutal, freezing winter, the fear within the settlement deepened, and simple face-down positioning was no longer deemed sufficient to contain the dead. The villagers began to incorporate increasingly violent, highly specific apotropaic modifications to their interments, fusing ancient folk magic with desperate physical precautions. In the village forge, the local blacksmith worked late into the night, his bellows roaring as he hammered iron scraps and broken plowshares into long, brutal iron stakes and heavy square nails. These iron implements were brought directly to the cemetery. Before a prone body was covered with dirt, the gravediggers would drive a long iron stake straight through the back of the corpse between the shoulder blades, piercing the heart and pinning the body directly into the hard floor of the grave like an insect fixed to a board. Iron was believed to possess pure, anti-demonic properties, a cold metal forged in fire that bound supernatural forces to the material realm. To further ensure that the Strigoi could never rise or torment the living, the villagers turned to their agricultural tools. Long, curved iron sickles, normally used to harvest the summer wheat, were placed directly beneath the chins of the corpses before they were turned face down. The sharp, razor-edged blade of the sickle was positioned snug against the windpipe and throat, so that if the body attempted to lift its head or push itself upward from the soil, the very action would sever its own throat, decapitating the creature beneath the earth. Furthermore, the gravediggers addressed a disturbing phenomenon known as the mastication of the dead, the unsettling, damp sound of decomposing bodies shifting inside their shrouds, which the peasants interpreted as the Strigoi devouring their own grave clothes to gather strength before digging out. To prevent this, smooth, heavy river stones, hauled from the icy beds of the nearby Prut River, were forced violently between the jaws of the deceased, shattering teeth and jamming the mouth open so that no chewing could take place. By the year 1653, these illegal, extreme burial practices had expanded from covert nighttime operations into the absolute standard procedure for the entire region. Word of these violent desecrations, body mutilations, and non-canonical burials eventually reached the higher authorities of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the regional magistrates in the princely court. Alarmed by reports of widespread superstitious heresy and the widespread exhumation of consecrated ground, church officials dispatched a delegation of senior clergy and monastic inspectors to the remote settlement. Their mission was clear: enforce church law, halt the illegal exhumations, punish those guilty of mutilating corpses, and restore proper, east-facing Christian burials to the parish. When the church officials arrived at the edge of the village in 1653, expecting to find an obedient, repentant peasantry willing to bow to ecclesiastical authority, they were met instead with open, hostile resistance. The terrified villagers gathered at the entrance of the parish cemetery, forming a dense human wall. Men, women, and elders stood shoulder to shoulder, wielding pitchforks, axes, and iron bars, blocking the priest and the church inspectors from entering the consecrated ground. The peasants declared openly that no representative of the church would be permitted to exhume their face-down dead, nor would any future victim of the sickness be buried on their back facing the sky. The conflict reached a dangerous, boiling impasse. The villagers were far more terrified of the supernatural fury of the Strigoi escaping the soil than they were of church excommunication or civil punishment. For 5 years, the earth had kept its dark secrets, but as a bitter, unexpected frost began to settle over the hills late in 1653, bringing with it a sudden, terrifying resurgence of the deadly pestilence, the brittle peace between church authority and human terror was about to shatter completely. As the year 1653 deepened, an unforgiving winter descended early upon the Moldavian highlands, locking the dense oak forests and scattered mountain villages in a vice of frost and iron-hard snow. With the biting winds came a horrific, sudden resurgence of the pestilence. The fever spread through the timber homes with terrifying speed, laying low entire households in a matter of days. Victims suffered from swollen black buboes in their armpits, delirium, and a dark, putrid fluid that leaked from their nostrils and lips before their hearts gave out. To the local peasantry, this sudden, violent wave of death was not a mere trial of flesh. It was the ultimate, inescapable proof that the consecrated earth had failed. The church officials who had demanded canonical, sky-facing burials were seen not as protectors of the realm, but as unwitting accomplices to a demonic resurgence. The villagers believed with absolute, agonizing certainty that the dead buried facing upward were rising in the black hours, drifting invisible through the wooden walls of the village to feast upon the breath and blood of their own surviving kin. Hysteria broke the final bonds of civil and religious restraint. The parish priest, stripped of his authority and fearing for his own life amidst the raging mob, retreated behind the heavy oak doors of the village chapel, his prayers drowned out by the howling wind and the furious shouts of his congregation. The villagers, armed with axes, iron-tipped spears, and heavy oak stakes, completely seized control of the parish cemetery. Under the cover of a pitch-black midnight, lit only by the smoky, sputtering amber flame of pine pitch torches and tallow lamps, the entire settlement gathered within the gates of the holy yard. The air was thick with the suffocating stench of burning resin, wet dog hair coats, and the bitter copper tang of pure fear. Men and young boys slammed iron spades and wooden mattocks into the frozen turf, the violent sound of metal ringing against subterranean rock echoing across the quiet valley like the tolling of a doom-laden bell. They began a systematic, furious exhumation of every grave dug over the preceding 3 months. The earth was torn open violently, dark mounds of dirt piled high against the snow-covered gravestones. Shovels scraped against crude pine coffins, and frantic hands ripped away the splintered lids. What the villagers witnessed beneath the flickering torchlight only confirmed their deepest, most nightmarish terrors. In the icy earth, natural decomposition had been slowed and warped by the freezing temperatures and damp soil. Corpses exhumed from the darkness exhibited the natural, biological signs of postmortem change, yet to the uneducated, terrified peasantry, these were the undeniable hallmarks of the Strigoi. Bodies were found swollen and bloated with gases, their limbs supple and unyielding to rigor mortis, their skin unnaturally pink or flushed. Most horrifying of all to the onlookers was the dark, purplish blood that had purged from the lungs and pooled around the dried, cracked lips of the deceased, staining the white shroud cloth beneath their chins. Screams of anguish and terror erupted through the cemetery as mothers recognized the faces of their dead children, now transformed in their eyes into blood-drinking revenants. The village elders did not hesitate. The time for prayers and holy water had passed. Only brutal, physical violence against the corpse could preserve the living from total extinction. A frantic, coordinated assembly line of apotropaic ritual began in the middle of the frozen churchyard. Dozens of bodies were hauled up from their muddy pits, their linen shrouds ripped open to expose skin glistening under the cold rain and falling snow. In a desperate, climactic effort to cleanse the consecrated ground once and for all, the villagers subjected every single suspect body to the ultimate physical binding. The local blacksmith, his hands black with soot and calloused from days of emergency labor, moved from coffin to coffin with a heavy iron sledgehammer and long, square-cut iron spikes forged from discarded wagon tires. With sickening, resonant thuds that reverberated through the chests of the weeping onlookers, long iron nails were driven directly through the palms of the dead, pinning their hands flat against the wooden coffin bottoms. Additional spikes were hammered through their ankles and directly through the center of their chests, shattering sternums and locking the bodies into the wooden frames so that no reanimated limb could ever find purchase to push upward through the earth. Then came the definitive act of turning. One by one, the bodies were lifted, flipped violently over, and laid strictly upon their stomachs. Their bloody faces were pressed directly into the frozen black silt at the bottom of the open trenches. The villagers forced large, smooth river stones dragged up from the icy shallows of the river in wicker baskets deep into the agape mouths of the corpses, shattering jawbones and jamming the oral cavities so that the dead could neither chew their shrouds nor utter demonic incantations beneath the soil. Long, curved steel sickles were laid across the napes of their necks, their razor edges pointed inward toward the vertebrae, ensuring that any upward movement of the head would result in instant, subterranean decapitation. Throughout the freezing night, the work continued without pause. Men, women, and children labored until their hands were bled raw and their breath came in ragged, icy plumes. Every grave in the parish cemetery was overturned, inspected, modified, and reburied face down. To ensure that no creature could ever exert the physical force required to lift the heavy weight of dirt above, the villagers loaded horse-drawn wooden carts with massive granite boulders harvested from the surrounding mountain slopes. As each face-down body was covered with a layer of dark, damp soil, heavy boulders were hoisted by groups of 4 and 5 men and hurled into the pits, creating dense, impenetrable cairns directly over the spines of the buried. The soil was pounded down with heavy wooden rammers until the earth was as solid and dense as stone. As the pale, gray light of dawn broke over the eastern horizon, illuminating a churchyard transformed into a landscape of jagged rock mounds and freshly turned black earth, a profound, eerie silence settled over the settlement. The midnight operation had reached its absolute climax. Dozens of former family members, neighbors, and children lay inverted beneath the frozen mud, their eyes staring blankly into the endless abyss of the subterranean darkness, their throats held hostage by steel, their mouths choked with river stone. By the late 1650s, as the brutal winter passed and the warmer months returned, the lethal wave of pestilence finally began to wane. The sudden drop in mortality was not understood by the isolated villagers as the natural end of an epidemic cycle or the result of acquired immunity. To the surviving population of the Moldavian settlement, the cessation of death was absolute, empirical proof of their horrific victory over the grave. The dead had been conquered not by the Latin chants of distant bishops or the incense of the parish altar, but by iron, stone, and the violent, physical inversion of the human form. The village had survived, but it had done so by turning its back on the sky, sealing its ancestors into an eternity of facing the deep earth, forever trapped beneath the heavy weight of human terror. In the late 1650s, as the brutal wave of pestilence finally receded into the damp forests of the Carpathian foothills, a heavy, exhausted stillness fell over the Moldavian settlement. The village had survived, but it emerged from the nightmare fundamentally transformed. The churchyard was no longer a gentle, holy field of wooden crosses pointing toward the rising sun. It had become an ominous citadel of granite cairns, a jagged field of stone sealing dozens of inverted corpses deep within the mud. The immediate panic of the outbreak began to fade, yet the psychological scars ran far too deep for life to ever return to what it had been before the contagion struck. The community entered a period of grim isolation, bound together by a shared, secret horror and an unyielding commitment to their new, unnatural burial customs. The extraordinary measures undertaken in the dark of night were not discarded once the sickness lifted. Instead, what had begun as an emergency act of desperate survival solidified into an unwritten, ironclad law of the countryside. The local peasantry had convinced themselves that their physical violence against the dead was the sole reason the pestilence had stopped. The act of inverting the human body had worked, and therefore, no future risk could be tolerated. For decades following the Great Outbreak, whenever a villager died under sudden, unexplained, or suspicious circumstances, the community refused to grant them a standard Christian burial. If an individual perished without receiving the final sacraments, if a child was born with an unusual birthmark or caul, if a woman died in the agony of childbirth, or if a stranger collapsed in the mountain passes, the village elders and gravediggers immediately intervened. The ritual was executed with quiet, practiced efficiency. The local Orthodox priest, his authority forever fractured by the events of 1648 and 1653, was no longer able to enforce canonical burials. Though he continued to recite the ancient Slavonic prayers for the dead from a safe distance at the perimeter of the churchyard, he watched in silent, helpless resignation as his parishioners turned every suspect body face down prior to lowering it into the trench. The river stones were still forced into agape jaws, the iron spikes were still driven through chest cavities, the heavy boulders were still dragged from the riverbeds to weigh down the dirt. The villagers lived in perpetual vigilance, convinced that the boundary between the living and the reanimated dead was thin and porous, kept intact only by the physical weight of stone and the directional inversion of the grave. As the 17th century drew to a close and gave way to the early 1700s, the memory of the Great Plague began to pass from first-hand experience into the realm of local folklore. Yet the physical reality of the churchyard remained, an inescapable testament to the terror of the previous generation. It was during this period of transition that the unique practices of the region caught the attention of one of the most remarkable intellectual figures in Eastern European history, Prince Dimitri Cantemir. Dimitri Cantemir was a polymath, scholar, composer, and ruler of Moldavia, a man who moved comfortably between the royal courts of Istanbul and St. Petersburg and held a coveted seat in the Royal Academy of Sciences in Berlin. A native son of the Moldavian principalities, Cantemir possessed a rare dual perspective. He was an enlightened thinker deeply trained in classical history, philosophy, and languages, yet he was intimately familiar with the dark, superstitious undercurrents that governed the daily lives of the peasants in the remote mountain villages of his realm. In the early 1700s, while living in exile and writing his monumental Latin work, Descriptio Moldaviae, a comprehensive historical, geographical, and ethnographic survey of his homeland, Cantemir set out to systematically document the extraordinary supernatural beliefs and burial customs of the Moldavian populace. Sitting at his writing desk, surrounded by leather-bound manuscripts and working under the soft glow of tallow candles, the prince recorded the deep-seated terror of the creature known in the native tongue as the Strigoi. With cold, analytical precision, Cantemir translated the visceral fears of the illiterate peasantry into the formal prose of Western scholarship. He wrote of how the local populations believed that certain deceased individuals possessed the tragic ability to return from the grave, returning to their former homes by night to drain the vitality of their surviving relatives and spread lethal sickness through the air. More importantly, Cantemir became the first scholar to officially record the precise, anti-vampiric measures practiced in the rural churchyards. He described how the peasants would exhume suspected bodies, inspect them for unnatural signs of post-mortem preservation, drive iron or wooden stakes directly through their hearts, and place sharp iron implements across their necks. Crucially, Cantemir documented the specific logic behind the prone burial. He recorded that the villagers laid the suspected dead face down into the soil so that if the corpse were to reanimate and attempt to dig its way out of the grave, its clawing fingers would dig deeper into the bowels of the earth rather than rising toward the air and sunlight. In the scholar's ink, the panicked acts of a desperate 17th-century mountain village were preserved for global history, transformed from local folk panic into an invaluable ethnographic record of early modern Eastern European belief systems. For nearly 3 centuries following Cantemir's death, his written accounts were often viewed by foreign scholars as colorful, exaggerated Gothic folklore, the dramatic prose of an aristocratic ruler romanticizing the archaic superstitions of his peasant subjects. The isolated churchyards of Moldavia were eventually abandoned or built over, the wooden crosses rotted away into topsoil, the granite cairns sank beneath centuries of accumulating leaf litter and thick forest undergrowth, and the stories of the face-down village faded into dusty academic footnotes. However, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the physical reality of these events was dramatically thrust back into the light of modern science. Bioarchaeologists and forensic anthropologists conducting systematic excavations of historic 17th-century graveyards across eastern Romania uncovered undeniable, physical proof of the terror that had once gripped the region. As modern archaeological teams carefully stripped away layers of dark, clay-heavy earth using trowels, fine brushes, and dental picks, they began to encounter anomalous burials that defied standard historical expectations. Instead of finding orderly rows of Christian skeletons lying on their backs with hands folded neatly across their chests and heads facing east toward the anticipated resurrection, the excavators uncovered scenes of deliberate, violent post-mortem restraint. The trowels struck large, smooth granite river boulders that had been artificially placed deep within the grave shafts, directly atop the spinal columns of the deceased. Beneath these heavy stones lay human skeletons lying entirely on their stomachs. Forensic examination confirmed that these individuals had been placed face down at the time of interment, their skulls violently rotated into the mud. In numerous cases, the osteological evidence was staggering. The jawbones of the skeletons were dislocated and fractured, jammed open around large, rounded cobblestones that remained lodged within the oral cavities hundreds of years after burial. Further cleaning of the remains revealed heavily corroded remnants of iron. Long, square-cut iron spikes were found rusting directly between thoracic ribs, their positions indicating they had been driven through the chest with tremendous force. Curved, rust-flaked iron blades, the unmistakable remains of 17th-century agricultural sickles, were found resting directly beneath the cervical vertebrae of inverted skulls, positioned in exact accordance with the ancient belief that any movement of the head would sever the neck. The physical evidence matched the written accounts of Dmitry Cantemir with terrifying precision. Forensic scientists analyzing the bones found no structural evidence that these individuals were vampires or supernatural beings. They were ordinary men, women, and children who had suffered from infectious diseases such as plague, cholera, or typhus. Their bodies bore the unmistakable marks of post-mortem trauma inflicted not by demonic forces, but by the frantic, terror-stricken hands of their own family members, neighbors, and friends. The unearthing of these face-down skeletons provided an unprecedented window into the psychological reality of 17th-century rural life. It demonstrated the profound, unimaginable desperation of a society living without modern medical knowledge, caught in the grip of lethal epidemics that swept through their isolated valleys like an invisible fire. To the 17th-century Moldavian peasant, the sudden, silent collapse of their loved ones was an event so horrifying, so utterly beyond rational comprehension, that only the existence of a predatory, subterranean evil could explain it. The historical cover hook text, the terrifying assertion that something kept escaping the graves, was ultimately revealed to be a profound reflection of human psychology in the face of catastrophe. What truly escaped the graves was not a reanimated monster of blood and shadow, but the invisible, relentless march of contagion, accompanied by the agonizing realization of human helplessness. In their desperate, absolute refusal to let death consume their world, the villagers turned their aggression upon the physical remains of the deceased. They transformed their cemetery into a prison, using the iron of their hearths, the stones of their rivers, and the very structure of the earth itself to bind their ancestors in perpetual dark motionlessness. Today, the physical artifacts and inverted skeletons preserved in museum archives stand as a haunting testament to an era when fear governed the boundary between the living and the dead. Deep beneath the quiet, wind-swept pastures of historical Moldavia, where the Carpathian forests whisper in the cold mountain air, the silent dead still rest in the posture forced upon them centuries ago. Turned away from the sky, their faces buried in the dark soil, they remain forever pinned to the deep earth, caught in an eternal stance of defense against a sky they were never permitted to see again.